June 6, 1944, 0600 hours. The English Channel, 5 miles off the coast of Normandy, France. The water is cold, around 13 degrees Celsius grey and churning under a sky that looks like wet concrete. The wind howls at 15 knots, pushing waves into whitecaps that slam against the hulls of thousands of landing craft. Inside these vessels, men are vomiting. They're shaking. Some are praying. Most are just trying not to think about what comes next. But here's the thing that should terrify them even more than the German machine guns waiting on those beaches. The plan says they're supposed to land without armor support. The infantry will hit the sand first, exposed, vulnerable, facing concrete bunkers and enfiladed positions that have been fortified for 4 years. The tanks, the big 30-ton Churchill and Sherman models that might actually give them a fighting chance. Those are supposed to come later, after the beaches are secured. Except you can't secure a beach without tanks. It's a catch-22 written in blood, unless you had someone crazy enough to make tanks swim. This is the story of Percy Hobart, a British general who was forced into retirement, called a lunatic by his own superiors, and then summoned back from obscurity to solve an impossible problem. This is the story of how a man's ridiculous idea tanks that could float, that could swim through the English Channel and arrive on the beaches in the first wave, became one of the most important tactical innovations of World War II. This is a story about the difference between brilliant and insane, and how that difference often depends on whether you win or lose. This is a story about D-Day, but not the D-Day you think you know. To understand why swimming tanks mattered, you have to understand what failure looked like. August 19th, 1942, Dieppe, France. British and Canadian forces launch a raid, supposedly to test German defences, to gather intelligence, to prove the Allies could land on a defended beach. It goes catastrophically wrong. Of the 6,000 men who land, more than half become casualties within 9 hours. The tanks that do make it ashore, Churchill models, either get stuck on the shingle, blown apart by anti-tank guns, or simply arrive too late to matter. The bodies pile up on the beach like driftwood. The water turns red. The survivors who make it back to England bring with them a lesson written in trauma. You cannot take a fortified beach with infantry alone. You need armor, but you need it immediately, in the first seconds of the landing, or you'll just be feeding men into a meat grinder. The problem is physics. Tanks are heavy, 30 tons of steel, armor, ammunition, and fuel. Landing craft can carry them, sure, but those craft have to get close to shore, and close to shore means German artillery can target them. Even if they make it, the tank has to drive off the ramp into water that might be chest-deep, engine-flooding, momentum-killing water. By the time a tank gets onto dry sand, the infantry who needed its support are already dead or pinned down. The Germans know this. They've built their Atlantic Wall based on this certainty. Armor arrives late or not at all. Enter Major General Percy Stanley Hobart. Hobie to his friends, if he had many, which he didn't. Hobart was 60 years old in 1943, a tall, lean man with a sharp face and sharper tongue. He looked like a particularly stern headmaster, which in a way he became. Hobart was a tank pioneer, one of the architects of British armoured doctrine between the wars, a man who understood that tanks weren't just mobile artillery. They were a revolution in warfare, a way to break through static defences and restore mobility to the battlefield. He'd commanded the 7th Armoured Division in Egypt, the famous Desert Rats, and turned them into one of the most effective fighting units in the British Army. But Hobart had a problem. He was right, and he knew it, and he wasn't shy about telling everyone else they were wrong. He criticised his superiors. He pushed for radical ideas. He made enemies. By 1940, those enemies had won. Hobart was forced into retirement and ended up serving in the Home Guard as a corporal, drilling shopkeepers and pensioners in a Cotswold village, his career apparently finished, his ideas dismissed as the ravings of an obsessive crank. Then came Dieppe. Then came the realization that the Allies were going to have to invade France eventually, and when they did, they needed solutions, not excuses. Winston Churchill himself intervened. Churchill had a soft spot for mavericks, for men who thought differently, probably because he was one himself. In March 1943, Hobart was recalled, promoted, and given one of the strangest commands in military history. The 79th Armoured Division, soon to be known as Hobart's Funnies. His mission was simple to state, impossible to execute. Invent the weapons that would allow men to survive landing on a defended beach. Hobart didn't invent the swimming tank from scratch, That credit goes to a Hungarian-British engineer named Nicholas Straussler, who'd been tinkering with the concept since the 1930s. But Hobart saw its potential. He saw that if you could make a tank float, if you could launch it from a landing craft thousands of yards offshore and let it swim to the beach under its own power, you could solve the timing problem. The tank would arrive with the infantry, or even before them. The Germans would suddenly face armor in the first seconds of the assault, when they expected only flesh. The DD tank duplex drive, though everyone called them Donald Duck tanks for obvious reasons, was brilliantly simple and completely insane. You took a standard Sherman tank, 30 tons of American steel. You welded a collapsible canvas screen around the hull, held up by inflatable rubber tubes and metal struts. When inflated, this screen extended upward, creating a boat-like shape that displaced enough water to keep the tank afloat barely. The tank's tracks were connected to two small propellers. In the water, the driver disconnected the main drive and engaged the propellers, which could push the tank through the water at about 4 miles per hour, slower than a man jogging, but faster than a landing craft under fire. Once the tank reached the beach, the crew deflated the screen, which collapsed down around the hull, re-engaged the normal drive, and suddenly you had a functional tank where seconds before there'd been what looked like a floating tent. It sounds crazy because it was crazy. The freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the top of the screen, was less than 3 feet in calm water. In the channel, with waves running 4 to 6 feet, the tanks would be swamped constantly. Water poured over the screen. The crews had to man pumps continuously just to keep from sinking. If a wave hit from the wrong angle, if the propeller struck debris, if the screen tore or deflated prematurely, the tank would drop like a stone to the bottom of the channel, trapping the crew inside a metal coffin in water too deep for escape. Training exercises saw tanks sink with regularity. Men drowned. Critics called the whole program a waste of resources, a folly, vintage Hobart lunacy. But Hobart believed, and more importantly, he made others believe. He ran relentless trials. He refined the design. He trained crews not just to operate the tanks, but to think differently, to understand that they were pioneers in a new kind of warfare. He faced down skeptics with data and demonstrations. When Montgomery, yes, that Montgomery, Bernard Law Montgomery, the Supreme Commander of Allied ground forces and coincidentally Hobart's brother-in-law, expressed doubts, Hobart invited him to watch a demonstration. Montgomery saw the tanks swim. He was convinced. The DD tanks were approved for D-Day. Spring 1944. Southern England has become an armed camp. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, mountains of supplies all converging on the channel ports. The invasion is coming, everyone knows it, including the Germans, though they don't know where or when. The weather is unpredictable, typical for the English coast. One day mild and calm, the next lashed by rain and wind. The men training for the assault practice in conditions that range from unpleasant to lethal. Exercise Tiger in late April turns into a massacre when German E-boats intercept a convoy during a landing rehearsal, killing over 700 American servicemen, more than would die on Utah Beach on D-Day itself. The losses are kept secret. The training continues. For the crews of the DD tanks, training is its own special kind of hell. They practice in the Solent, in the Thames estuary, in any body of water rough enough to simulate channel conditions. They learn to read waves, to angle the tank to avoid being swamped, to keep the pumps running, to navigate by compass, because once you're in the water, surrounded by canvas, you can't see anything but sky. They learn to trust the engineering, even as they watch tanks sink during exercises. They learn the escape procedures, how to blow the hatches, how to get out of the turret, how to inflate your life vest before the tank drags you down. Some crews refuse to go. They're replaced. There's no room for doubt, not now, not with so much at stake. The plan for D-Day calls for 5 beach landings, Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold, Juno and Sword for the British and Canadians. The DD tanks are assigned to all of them, but each beach presents different challenges. At Utah and the British beaches, the tanks will launch from around 5,000 yards offshore, nearly 3 miles of open water. At Omaha, the plan initially calls for a similar launch distance, but conditions will force last-minute changes. Each tank battalion has been assigned to support specific infantry units. The timing is choreographed down to the minute. The tanks must hit the beach at H hour, the very moment the first infantry landing craft ground their ramps in the sand. Not before they can't wait exposed on the beach. Not after the infantry will be slaughtered without them. The men know the odds. They've been briefed on Dieppe. They know that German defences have only gotten stronger since 1942. They know about the beach obstacles, the Belgian gates, the hedgehogs, the mines, the tetrahedra, all designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. They know about the bunkers with their interlocking fields of fire, the 88mm guns positioned to enfilade the beaches, the mortars pre-registered on every yard of sand. They know that the first waves will take the heaviest casualties. They write letters home, the kind you write when you're not sure there'll be another chance. They check their equipment obsessively. They wait. June 5th. The invasion was supposed to launch that day, but the weather is terrible. Gale force winds, low clouds, heavy seas. Eisenhower postpones for 24 hours. The men who've been sealed in their staging areas, who've already said their mental goodbyes, now have to wait another day, another night, stewing in their fear and anticipation. The meteorologists predict a brief window of slightly better weather on the 6th, not good, but acceptable. Eisenhower makes the call. We go. The evening of June 5th, the loading begins. Tanks drive onto landing craft, crews stow their gear, check the canvas screens one more time, test the pumps and propellers. The fleet assembles, the largest armada in history. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft, stretching across the channel in lanes that have been swept for mines. The naval bombardment forces move ahead, battleships and cruisers that will pummel the German positions starting at dawn. The air forces are already at work, bombers hitting coastal defences, paratroopers dropping inland to secure the flanks. Everything is synchronized, a vast machine of violence pointed at a 50-mile stretch of French coast. In the landing craft carrying the DD tanks, the crews try to rest. It's impossible. The boats pitch and roll in the swells. The smell of diesel fuel and vomit fills the cramped spaces. Some men play cards by flashlight. Some pray. Some just stare at nothing. Minds already on the beach on what comes next. The commander's Hobart is back in England, his job done. Now it's up to the battalion and company commanders go over the plans one more time, knowing that plans never survive contact with the enemy, knowing that in a few hours they'll be improvising, reacting, trying to keep men alive in chaos. Midnight passes. June 6th has arrived. The weather is still marginal overcast, wind at 15 knots, seas running at 4 to 5 feet, temperature around 13 degrees Celsius. Not ideal for swimming tanks, but nothing about this invasion is ideal. The fleet advances through the darkness. On the horizon, the coast of France is invisible, just a suggestion, a dark line separating sea from sky. The naval guns begin their bombardment, great flashes of light, thunder rolling across the water. The invasion of Europe has begun. Dawn comes slowly. A grey light that seems to seep into the sky rather than break through it. By 05:30 there's enough light to see, though visibility is poor, maybe 3 to 4 miles through the haze and smoke. The bombardment has intensified, destroyers firing at point-blank range, rockets streaking from landing craft toward the beaches, the noise a constant roar that you feel in your chest as much as hear. The assault waves form up, landing craft circling in designated areas, waiting for the signal to head in. For the DD tank crews, this is the moment. The landing craft carrying them LCTs, landing craft tank approach their launch points. The plan calls for launching at around 6,000 yards offshore for most beaches. But commanders on scene have to make real-time decisions based on sea conditions. At Utah Beach, the seas are judged manageable. 28 DD tanks of the 79th Tank Battalion launch. They hit the water and immediately begin taking waves over the screen. Pumps work frantically. The crews fight to keep the bow pointed into the waves, to maintain speed, to navigate toward a beach they can barely see through the spray and smoke. It's terrifying, a 30-ton vehicle bobbing like a cork, water everywhere, the sense that at any moment you could sink and there'd be no help, no rescue, just the long fall to the bottom. But they make it, nearly all of them. The DD tanks swim for almost 40 minutes, covering nearly 3 miles of open ocean, and arrive on Utah Beach within minutes of H-hour. The infantry land. The Germans open fire, and suddenly there are tanks that seem to rise out of the sea itself. Screens collapsing, guns traversing, 75mm cannons engaging the bunkers and strong points. The effect on German defenders is psychological as much as tactical. They'd expected to slaughter the first waves before armor could arrive. Instead, armor is already there, providing covering fire, suppressing positions, blasting holes in obstacles. Utah Beach, which could have been a bloodbath, becomes the most successful landing of the day. American casualties are relatively light, fewer than 200 killed. The DD tanks are a significant reason why. At Sword Beach, British DD tanks of the 13th and 18th Royal Hussars launch at around 7,000 yards. Conditions are rougher here. Waves break over the screens constantly. 2 tanks sink on the way in. Their crews lost. But the rest make it. They arrive on the beach just as the infantry touch down and immediately engage German positions. The fortress at La Brèche, a major strongpoint, is hit by multiple tank rounds, its guns silenced. The infantry are able to move inland with armor support from the first moments. Sword Beach is secured by mid-morning. At Gold Beach, the DD tanks launch closer in around 5,000 yards because the seas are running higher. They still face a harrowing swim, but again, most make it. They land. They fight. They provide the edge that allows the British 50th Infantry Division to push off the beach and begin the drive inland. At Juno Beach, Canadian DD tanks face similar conditions. Rough seas, long swim, but successful landing. The Canadians push further inland on D-Day than any other Allied force, reaching the outskirts of Caen, largely because they have armor support from the beginning. And then there's Omaha. Omaha Beach is different. It's always been different. The beach is overlooked by bluffs up to 170 feet high. The German 352nd Infantry Division defending it is one of the best units in Normandy. Experienced, well-equipped, alert. The beach is only about 300 yards wide at high tide, a killing ground with almost no cover. 5 draws narrow valleys provide the only exits. Everyone is fortified, pre-sighted by German gunners. The naval bombardment here is less effective. Many shells fall inland, missing the beach defenses. The air bombardment is even worse in the darkness and cloud. Bombers drop their loads too late, hitting empty fields miles inland. The German defenses at Omaha are largely intact when the first Americans arrive. The plan calls for DD tanks to launch at 6,000 yards offshore. 2 companies, 64 tanks total, assigned to support the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. But when the landing craft carrying them reach the launch point, the commanders see waves running at 5 to 6 feet, wind gusting, conditions far worse than at the other beaches. Some commanders make the call to swim anyway. Others decide it's suicide and take their tanks all the way to the beach. Company B of the 741st Tank Battalion launches at 5,000 yards. Within minutes, disaster. Tanks are swamped almost immediately. The screens can't handle the seas. Water pours in faster than the pumps can expel it. Tanks begin to sink. Crews scramble to escape. Some make it. Blowing hatches, inflating vests, swimming for their lives in water so cold it saps strength in minutes. Others don't. Tank after tank disappears beneath the waves, 5 men trapped inside each one. Of 32 tanks launched, only 2 make it to the beach. The rest are at the bottom of the channel. Company A makes a different call. The commander, seeing the conditions, orders the LCTs to take the tanks all the way in. It's a gamble. Landing craft are vulnerable, but it works. The LCTs drive right up to the beach, drop their ramps, and the tanks drive off into shallow water. 8 tanks make it onto Omaha Beach. 8 tanks, supporting 2 reinforced infantry regiments landing across 6,000 yards of beach. It's not enough. Not nearly enough. Omaha Beach in the first hour is hell made manifest. The infantry hit the sand and are immediately pinned down by fire from every angle: machine guns, mortars, artillery, rifles. Men huddle behind beach obstacles, behind the bodies of their comrades, behind nothing at all because there is no cover. The few tanks that made it ashore are targets for German 88s. Some are knocked out almost immediately. The infantry can't move. Officers and sergeants are hit trying to organize their men. The wounded drown in the tide. The beach is choked with burning vehicles, dead men, equipment that will never be used. For a few hours, the outcome is in doubt. Omaha is on the verge of failing. It doesn't fail because of individual acts of courage, because of destroyers that risk running aground to provide close fire support, because of follow-on waves that keep coming despite the carnage, and yes, because of the handful of tanks, DD tanks that made it, and conventional tanks landed later, that provide enough firepower to start suppressing German positions. By noon, small groups of Americans have fought their way off the beach and are climbing the bluffs. By evening, Omaha is secured, but at a cost: over 2,000 American casualties, many in the first hour. It's the most costly landing of D-Day, and it's a stark illustration of what happens when armor support is inadequate. The contrast is brutal and clear. At Utah, Sword, Gold, and Juno, where DD tanks arrived in numbers and on time, casualties are relatively light and objectives are achieved. At Omaha, where the DD tanks largely failed due to sea conditions and command decisions, the landing nearly collapses and the butcher's bill is staggering. The DD tanks didn't guarantee success, but their absence almost guaranteed disaster. By midnight on June 6th, 156,000 Allied troops are ashore in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress, has been breached in 5 places. The lodgement is fragile. The beaches are still under artillery fire. The Allies haven't linked up the landing zones. German counterattacks are coming. But the invasion has succeeded. The Allies have a foothold in France. The cost has been significant but bearable. Allied casualties on D-Day total around 10,000, with approximately 4,000 confirmed dead. It's a fraction of what was feared. Pessimistic estimates before the invasion projected casualties as high as 50% in the first waves. That didn't happen, in large part because of innovations like the DD tank that allowed armor to support the infantry from the very beginning. Of the 156 DD tanks launched across all 5 beaches, approximately 120 reached shore and engaged in combat. 36 were lost, most at Omaha, most to the sea rather than enemy fire. The crews of those sunken tanks, nearly 200 men, died doing something no soldiers had done before, taking tanks into combat by swimming them across miles of open ocean. It was a new kind of courage, born of a new kind of warfare. Percy Hobart never set foot on the Normandy beaches on D-Day. His job was done before the first landing craft hit the sand, but his influence was everywhere. Beyond the DD tanks, his 79th Armored Division provided other specialized vehicles: the flail tanks that cleared mines, the bobbin tanks that laid temporary roadways across soft sand, the crocodile tanks that shot flame, the AVRE tanks that launched massive demolition charges against bunkers. These Funnies all served the same purpose: to give attacking troops an edge against defenses that should have been impregnable. They represented a different kind of military thinking, problem-solving, innovative, willing to look ridiculous if it meant saving lives. The DD tank concept continued to evolve. They were used again in later amphibious operations, in southern France, in Italy, in the Rhine crossings in 1945. The lessons learned influenced amphibious doctrine for decades. Modern amphibious assault vehicles, the AAV-7s, the expeditionary fighting vehicles of recent decades, are direct descendants of Hobart's swimming tanks, refined and improved but based on the same principle. Armor must arrive with the infantry, not after. But in the immediate aftermath of D-Day, as the armies pushed inland and the focus shifted to the battles for Caen, for the Bocage country, for the breakout and the race across France, the DD tanks faded from prominence. They'd done their job. They were no longer needed in the same way. The crews who'd swum them across the channel were folded back into regular tank units, their specialized training less relevant in the hedgerows and forests of Normandy. The tanks themselves were often converted back to standard models, the canvas screens and propellers removed, the evidence of their amphibious capability stripped away. History has a funny way of forgetting the things that worked. We remember the disasters Omaha Beach is famous precisely because it was so costly, so chaotic, so close to failure. We remember the dramatic moments, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the paratroopers at Sainte-Mère-Église, the British gliders at Pegasus Bridge. These are the stories that make good cinema, that capture imagination. But the things that prevented disaster, the innovations that made success possible rather than miraculous, those often slip into obscurity. The DD tank is one of those forgotten successes. If you ask someone about D-Day, they might mention Higgins boats. They might mention the Atlantic Wall. They might mention Eisenhower's decision to go despite the weather. Few will mention the swimming tanks. Few will know that on 4 of the 5 landing beaches, armored vehicles that looked like floating tents swam through rough seas to arrive at the moment they were needed most, changing the tactical calculus, giving infantry a fighting chance, saving thousands of lives. Percy Hobart lived until 1957, dying at 71, long enough to see the Cold War replace the World War he'd helped win. He never fully escaped controversy. He was difficult, opinionated, often right in ways that annoyed his colleagues. But he was eventually recognized for what he'd achieved. Churchill, who'd saved his career, wrote that Hobart had imagination and drive in the development of armored forces. Montgomery, initially skeptical, came to appreciate his brother-in-law's genius. The British Army, slowly and grudgingly, acknowledged that Hobart's Funnies had been instrumental in making D-Day possible. But Hobart's real legacy isn't in memorials or official histories. It's in the idea that warfare requires constant innovation, that the side willing to look foolish, to try the untested, to believe in the seemingly ridiculous, often gains the decisive advantage. The DD tank shouldn't have worked. A 30-ton vehicle, propelled by tiny propellers, surrounded by a canvas screen, swimming through the English Channel in rough seas. It sounds like a joke. It looked absurd. During training exercises, observers laughed. Critics called it Hobart's folly, until it worked, until those ridiculous swimming tanks emerged from the waves on D-Day morning and started shooting. And suddenly, the laughter stopped, and the critics went silent. Innovation in warfare isn't about looking smart. It's about solving problems. Hobart understood that. He understood that you don't win wars by doing what's conventional. You win by doing what's necessary, even if it means making a tank swim. There's a broader lesson here, beyond military history. D-Day succeeded not because of overwhelming force, though the Allies had that, but because of meticulous planning, attention to detail, and willingness to try radical solutions to difficult problems. The invasion could have failed in 100 different ways. The weather could have been worse. The intelligence could have been wrong. The German reserves could have arrived sooner. But it didn't fail, in part because men like Hobart looked at the problem of amphibious assault and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. The men who crewed those DD tanks, who climbed into a metal vehicle surrounded by canvas and drove it into the sea, who spent 40 minutes wondering if the next wave would be the one that swamped them, who arrived on a hostile beach and fought, and in many cases died there, they were pioneers. They were testing not just a new weapon, but a new concept. And they proved it worked. Today, if you visit the beaches of Normandy, you'll find monuments to the divisions that landed there, to the Rangers and the paratroopers, to the infantry regiments and the engineers. You'll find cemeteries with thousands of white crosses. You'll find museums with artifacts and exhibits. You'll find preserved bunkers and gun emplacements, reminders of the defenses that had to be overcome. You probably won't find much about the DD tanks. There might be a mention in a museum, a photograph, maybe a restored example if you look hard enough. The tanks themselves mostly didn't survive. They were used up, converted, scrapped after the war. The men who crewed them went home, and like so many veterans, they didn't talk much about what they'd done. The innovation that helped make D-Day possible became a footnote, remembered by specialists and historians but largely unknown to the public. But here's what matters. On June 6, 1944, when it counted most, when lives hung in the balance and the fate of the invasion was uncertain, Percy Hobart's ridiculous swimming tanks worked. They swam through rough seas. They arrived on time. They provided the armor support that made the difference between success and catastrophe on 4 out of 5 beaches. They were one piece of an enormous puzzle, but an essential piece. The lesson of the DD tank isn't really about tanks at all. It's about the value of unconventional thinking, about the courage required to champion ideas that others dismiss, about the importance of solving problems rather than accepting them. It's about a military establishment that was flexible enough, barely, to give a recalled, difficult 60-year-old general the resources to pursue his strange ideas. It's about soldiers willing to trust in engineering and training and luck, to climb into a vehicle that shouldn't float and drive it into combat. War is often won or lost on such margins on ideas that work just well enough, on innovations that provide a temporary advantage, on the willingness to try something new when the old ways lead only to slaughter. D-Day was won by many factors: naval and air superiority, deception operations that fooled the Germans about the invasion site, leadership at every level, and the raw courage of soldiers who ran toward danger. But it was also won by swimming tanks, by crocodiles that breathed flame, by flails that cleared mines, by all the strange contraptions that emerged from Percy Hobart's workshops and proved their worth on the beaches. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, and the Allies counted their dead and consolidated their positions, few people paused to think about the eccentric general whose tanks had swum across the channel. There were more immediate concerns: the wounded to treat, the supplies to land, the German counterattacks to prepare for. The invasion would continue for months, the war for another year. D-Day was just the beginning. But it was a beginning made possible by people willing to imagine the impossible, by engineers who figured out how to make steel float, by commanders who trusted in untested technology, by soldiers who believed that a canvas screen and a prayer might be enough to get them to the beach alive. They were right. Just barely, in many cases, but right enough. And that made all the difference. The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer. Motto of the British Airborne Forces, and equally applicable to the men who made tanks swim.